Welcome to the Point of No Return podcast, a show at the intersection of technology and strategy. On this show, we interview industry leaders and experts to better understand how they think about strategy during this time of exponential progress.
Bonjour tout le monde, welcome to the Point of No Return podcast. On today's show, I spoke with a good friend of mine, Carlos Pacheco, CMO at Truly Social. Carlos and I had a chance to catch up over a podcast which we've been talking about doing for a while. Carlos is an ex-Montrealer. We lost him to the good old city of Toronto, but we still catch up from time to time. I'm really happy that he took the time. A little bit on Carlos's background. He's worked in media buying and strategy for 14 years now across many different local, national, international brands. He had a big jump in his career when he helped build the YouTube channel for a little company called Just for Laughs. So he moved away from the agency space to learn about content, the world of media production and content distribution, where he was able to get a larger view of the world of media, how it's created, sold, monetized, and consumed. His experiences helped him understand the world of online, how to build organic digital audiences using SEO and social content. On the show, we had a really good conversation about how he got started in the digital marketing space, how he helped propel Just for Laughs, their presence on YouTube from several thousand views to tens of millions, creating content for the social era. We spoke about podcasts as a medium, so a bit of a fan, obviously, of the medium. We had a really interesting chat on that. And then something he calls the social platform wars, which is really interesting. I'm really happy Carlos took the time. If you are interested in media and marketing, I think that you'll enjoy the conversation. So I'm really happy we're able to catch up, man. I know it's been a while. Obviously, we see each other less now that you're in Toronto, but I'm super happy that you took the time this morning. One question, man, I've never asked you to maybe kick things off is how did you get interested in this whole digital media thing?
Oh, man, this goes back to, falling into the world of marketing in general. I didn't go to school to be in marketing. I went to school I was good in math. So I was going to be like an assistant accountant, studied to be an accountant, and I fell into marketing because, at the time, people just needed to have computer skills, Excel, and just know how to handle a computer. And back in the day, I was hired by this agency called Donor Canada to just go in and do what we called matching. And anyways, it was sort of like, I fell into the world of marketing that way, and then, ended up going to Cossette after a few years and working on traditional advertising for Bell. But I always had because I didn't study in marketing, I sort of had this perception of I'm not sure I believe in the concept in just putting ads out there and thinking that it's going to change people's minds, and no real sort of real-time data. And then the internet was starting, but it was starting to become more and more important. And when I started to see metrics and real-time data, that's when I started really paying attention to that. And at the time, Cossette had a small digital team. I should have raised my voice way earlier. But I was sort of like this, quiet person and just just doing my job. But once I finally said to somebody, hey, I'd like to go to digital, my life changed. I went from being a very passive market, sort of somebody in an agency that just, came in, punched out, to somebody who was extremely passionate about the industry and wanted to learn as much as possible, because I loved the data. Sort of really spoke to me to see real-time metrics and performance and being able to adjust. And, it's been a love affair since then. And it's been a constant evolution of learning new things that constantly evolve, where I find traditional marketing, when I say traditional, I mean sort of analog marketing, tends to stay the same. And it's, maybe you have new placements, like a new billboard somewhere, but it's still the same product every month, every year. So yeah, I mean, that's a little bit of how I got into it and how I, kept, it sort of shaped my life in this industry.
Yeah, it's similar. It's a similar story to mine as well, right? Like you kind of like fall into the space, you're not quite sure what you want to do, and then you discover that there's this whole new growing field that's moving super rapidly. Curious to kind of like pick your brain on what specific. You mentioned data and being able to measure. Obviously, there's the whole novelty of it, the sense of like this thing is taking over. Curious to understand like what elements of it you think were the most attractive to you in your personality, right? Because it seems like you've done so many different stuff in the space. So curious to see like what most attracted you.
I guess the fact that you could really see how people were engaging with your content back then, right, or with your ads, and seeing what was performing, as opposed to putting a message out there and just like finding out 6 months later that it reached 5 million people, but you have no idea if those 5 million people actually were paying attention to the TV screen when the show was on air, right? And that's the part that sort of always attracted me more about of digital. I just loved that I could see that if a message was resonating, a site was better, and the nicher things got, that the more activity would happen around like a campaign. Like it wasn't about like, you would choose back in the day, it was be a simpatico, and it was sort of like you'd buy an ads on there and be like huge amount of reach, but like the cost per click was like super low, but also the click through ratio was also low. But then you'd buy a smaller, super niche site and get like these amazing, CTRs, click through ratios, and to me, I love to see the sort of the difference in how communities online, even then, even though didn't call it social media, like back then it was still communities, and the communities were the strongest ones, as opposed to the big sort of like broadcast platforms trying to, create this broadcast ecosystem online.
Yeah, yeah, it's yeah, it goes back to what you were saying about measurement. So I really relate to that. And you also spent a long time in the agency space, which I also did, but you
Mm-hmm.
managed to get out, right? So like it's one of those like inside jokes, right? You have agency lifers, people that just stay there for a long time. How
Mm-hmm.
did you manage to get out? And obviously, I want to like kind of segue into what you did at Just for Laughs, but you spent I think close to 11 years from cassette then to
Yeah.
Touche. What made you think I'm like what, maybe the agency life isn't for me at this point in my life.
Well, after it's actually 14 years overall in agencies, but yeah, I mean, I spent 9 years at Cassette, for about 3 to 4 years at Touche, and through my career, because it was never sort of like my fundamental goal, I always sort of like did lateral moves, right? I would never sort of like want to become like the chief digital marketer or chief digital whatever within agency, and I I always wanted to learn sort of something new, right? And at the time I left the world of agencies, I had shifted away from traditional marketing, then to digital marketing, then to search marketing. And at the time, and also social media marketing, which was much more just running ads on social media platforms. I mean, to a point where I'm the one who set up the first sort of like uh, Facebook paid campaigns within Touche, right? And back in the day, we used to use like the boss's credit card, right? And it would get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I sort of like, after a while, I just started feeling sameish again. Like I get bored, right? And I was doing search engine marketing, and then a friend of ours, within the industry said, hey, I heard Just for Laughs is looking for somebody in the digital space. And I went to meet with Andy Nelman, who to this day I consider a mentor, who gave me a chance. He basically told me, he says, "Hey, these guys at the Gags, this studio in the east end of Montreal, have something, but they don't know what to do with it, and they need somebody with at least some digital knowledge to take a stab at it." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm ready for a change. Just for Laughs is part of the Montreal DNA, and I grew up with it, so it would be great to go work for that." And I needed a change, so I went there. That was sort of like the sort of my evolution or what became my love about, content and audiences and digital audiences and building audiences online. Once I jumped into that, it was sort of like an awakening for me, because even back in my agency days, I used to sort of like flirt with the idea of like building audiences. I even part-timed with a couple of colleagues that were building a blog back then called Limited Hype. And I was in no way a good writer, but my sort of expertise was much more in the behind the scenes of like how to shape the content so that it gets discovered more and more. And it's sort of like the SEO, search engine optimization side of things, where the guys were creators and I was just trying to fix that. Once in a while, I would create something, but I was just not at that level. Anyways, yeah. And then I jumped into Just for Laughs. Just for Laughs had this YouTube channel that they were just like throwing stuff out there. I got some traction, but not really. I went in with sort of a marketing mindset, started shaping things around, fixing the way the YouTube channel sort of was set up, having conversations with YouTube and looking and just discovering the best practices around YouTube, which weren't really out there. But if anybody who had any sort of like experiences about search engine optimization, would quickly see, oh, they're not doing a lot of things right. And I looked at YouTube as YouTube was like Google within Google, right? It was sort of like an ecosystem within Google that used the same sort of practices, but stayed within its ecosystem. And within, I would say, 12 to 18 months, we restructured that YouTube channel and built about like half a dozen other YouTube channels. And, the main channel went from 300,000 subscribers, which is already decent at the time. We're talking about I think about 6-7 years ago, to, in 18 months, it went from 300,000 to almost 4 million subscribers. There were days when we were getting 10,000 subscribers a day. And it was amazing to see, right? And, it gave us so much, data that the creators never had. The creators are very traditional TV producers, and they produce a piece of content, they send it to the head office distributes it, sends it to TV networks do their thing, give you back a very little picture of who's watching. And I came in and showed them this new sort of opportunity to say, hey, you're generating between 4 to 5 million views a day on YouTube, and we can gather the information about who's watching, when they're watching, which jokes work better than others, and we can really optimize for this platform. And that was sort of like a complete awakening into the YouTube ecosystem, the world of YouTubers and the world of YouTube networks, which have evolved many, many ways in the last, 5 to 6 years.
The growth and the metrics is just outstanding, right? Like obviously it's, like you said, it was still early days, but it's still something that's quite an accomplishment. We won't dive into the revenue impact, but it's also something that was just like a huge boon to the Just for Laughs business as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it put them in the map in markets where they weren't really focused on, I'll even say to this day, they're still not taking advantage of it the way they should. And, they're still trying to jump into the, entertainment ecosystem and not jumping into the sort of like the digital ecosystem in a way that would, develop into a younger audience. But that's, my perception from way back here.
I'll fast forward a little bit in terms of like your career, because I want to talk about Truly Social, and I want to pick your brain about a few trends. You spent a few years at Boat Rocker, which in Toronto, which I think you moved from Montreal to Toronto for that gig, and then something brought you back to the agency life. So you got out, now you're back in. So I'd love to explore obviously your relationship with Tara, and then what convinced you to make the jump to get back into the space at Truly Social.
Yeah, I mean, Boat Rocker came and get me, after a couple of years at Just for Laughs. I wanted to do new things on YouTube, and unfortunately, at the time, Just for Laughs was just not ready to sort of like invest in it. Boat Rocker came in and said, "We want to build a YouTube network. We want to do stuff in Toronto." And I said, great. And the founders of Boat Rocker are, Dave and Ivan and John are like one of the most like down to earth guys I've ever, met, and, entrepreneurial and super supportive guys. And they, embraced me and let me do what I did at Just for Laughs with their content. We quickly saw that the whole YouTuber network ecosystem was not ideal for the Canadian market and was not doable from a production house or a company that does production. It's much more of a marketing network play than anything else. And what I did is essentially for 2 to 3 years is look at the library they have, how can we exploit it on these platforms in a way that doesn't hurt the or enhances their IPs, and that sort of like rinse and repeated what I did at Just for Laughs with a little bit more strategy and a little bit more support in terms of like understanding that this is building something that building brands within the company, which was just used to producing a show and then like moving on to the next project. 4 years later, they have a couple of online IPs that help their distribution department sell the shows, sell their IPs across the world. I was told by their distribution head that because we built a YouTube and social media ecosystem around one of their brands, one of their kids' brands, that they were able to sell the show to a big, U.S. network because they had that presence there, and that impressed them. Whereas, at the previous location, they were fighting me tooth and nail, not to sort of like, put that content out there, and that it was hurting their sales and all that sort of stuff. So there was definitely a different type of, perception at Boat Rocker. One of the things that I always say when I talk about Boat Rocker is that I joined Boat Rocker when we were like a dozen or if maybe 20 in the office. By the time I left, the company approached 600 employees, not because of me, more because of the leadership, where we got majority investment from Fairfax, and then the company was like, go forth and grow, and they bought a bunch of other companies, and that just multiplied the opportunities to build sort of like a digital ecosystem within the company and a centralized ecosystem, a centralized team that would support, all their properties across the board. And that was sort of my experience at Boat Rocker. And, what brought me, let me leave wasn't that I didn't love Boat Rocker. To this day, it's one of the best experiences I've ever had in my life. Is that, my wife, during this time, during the two to 3 years ago, we were in Toronto, my wife, Tara Hunt, she started, doing consultancy. She had a job at a PR firm and a content marketing, sort of a brand publishing firm, and got let go. And then she decided to make a video about being let go. And the video was supposed to be just, I got let go and I'm looking for a job, help me out. But it turned into a YouTube series, and that YouTube series turned into clients coming in, and more people sort of like hiring her and asking for her advice for her strategy. And then 2 years down the line, she's at 6 to 7 employees and has a fully fledged firm handling multiple clients. And there was always sort of this joke between me and her that I'd come work with her and help her out because I have much more of a paid media perspective, whereas she has a much more of a sort of social and community based sort of approach, and sort of complement each other on that way. And the opportunity came when a client came in and they're like, hey, I'm going to really need you to help me with this client. And I was like, okay, well, I think it's time. And I would say that was the most emotional moment in my life where I had to quit, where I quit my job, where like I was like, my voice was like, cracking when I was speaking to Ivan at Boat Rocker. And I would say like, it's not that I don't love this company. It's just that, like we're building our own thing that we believe in. And it's not like a traditional marketing agency, which is what I love about it. And what kind of the reason why it brought me back. If it was another, traditional big agency calling, I would have said no. this is a small agency that's much more focused on audience building and sort of like true relationships between brands and their audience that really speaks to the way I think brands should approach the web. Phew.
How did you approach it? It's obviously it's a great story, right? One that I think is super interesting because you went from really big brand, world famous brand just for last to a more niche, but still a pretty big company, like 80, 90 people, to essentially a startup, right?
Yeah.
So 7 people.
Yeah.
Did you consider the element? Was there an element of risk for you in the decision making? Becoming a partner. Obviously, your wife being the kind of the face of the company, leading Truly Social.
Mm-hmm.
Was there an element of risk, or considering what you had seen so far from pretty close for you, it was a no brainer as a decision? Obviously, it sounds like you were a bit, how should I say, a bit challenged by making the actual call. So curious to understand your psychology at the time.
Well, I mean, at the time, the agency was, we don't even want to use the word agency. We want to use it more of a firm type of situation thing for us. But I would say at the time, the growth was consistent and made a lot of sense because there was a lot of things that Tara would ask me on our, almost on a daily basis about, what she's doing with clients. And I would give my perspective and I would say I would do it this way, I would do it that way. And I felt like, I could sort of add to, what she's offering. And yes, I mean, it was a sort of hard choice. It was a shocker of a choice for me because, what I mean by that is that it was a shock to the system because I was used to companies that, HR was handled, payroll was handled, all that sort of stuff that I didn't need to think about. I just had to think about my job. And we come here and, all that needs to be, part of your job now. Right. And to this day, I'm 6 months in, and, it's still a challenge for me to sort of wrap my head around, the idea that we have to be thinking about all of these things at the same time as thinking about strategies for our clients and executing those strategies. I think it was a crash course for me. Not for Tara's looking at me like she's laughing because it's part of her DNA. She's been an entrepreneur for all her life. She's built companies. She's been an intrapreneur as well within companies. And, to her, it's par for the course. Whereas for me, it was much more of a crash course. And, it's still, it's fascinating. It's a challenge. It's a learning, experience for me. I'll be the first one to sort of admit that at times when it comes to running a company, I'm like a deer in headlights. I'm like, what the F is happening and how do I handle it? Whereas Tara's like, well, we handle it this way. And I'm like, oh, okay. And, I completely commend my wife for building this company and sort of steering the ship at this point. I'm, slowly, learning the ropes and taking over some of the stuff that she's been, handling up until this point so that she can become a little bit more of a figurehead within the company so that she can focus on the things that, that she loves about this job, the strategy, the client relationships, the being out there and talking about what we do and all that sort of stuff. That's been a little bit of my experience over the last 6 months.
I'd love to dive into what something you said here. We're not an agency; we're more of a firm, right? And I think you're trying to position your company in a different manner, right? Because social media marketing is, you walk outside and you trip over 5 people that claim to be experts, right? So I'd love to understand what is Truly Social's point of view. What are you guys trying to do differently with your approach to clients? It's obviously, you've been yielding results and success for your customers and obviously for you guys as well with your growth. So curious to dive into a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we know that, social media agencies are a dime a dozen and that, your cousin's kid is usually the first person you hire to handle your social media. And, there's a lot of agencies out there that are just, they're just, they just built they built a Twitter following and all of a sudden they're strategists. And we come at this with, first off, with experience, right? We've been through the ropes in this ecosystem, and we're not about, sort of just getting you likes. We're about, understanding who your audience is and using these platforms to really get to the root of who the audience or your customer is and what type of content they consume, to put your brand in front of them. And we've sort of like approached this from a different perspective and a much more experienced perspective. And we do feel like there is a place for people to sort of like, for junior people to learn, but also like that companies need to sort of like embrace this space in a much more sort of like strategic way, as opposed to, we just need to tweet our news, our press release every couple of days. And the way we approach this is by really deep diving into like who your audience is, what their content they're consuming, who they're following, who influences them. And just, like that type of research is not done by your average social media agency that just, starts putting nice pictures on Instagram in the hopes of getting likes. We want to make sure that we're putting the right content in front of the people that, you want to be in front of. And sometimes we bring, and at the same time, we bring insights into the audience that, you think and then all of a sudden you're like realizing, holy, wow, they're like, they do behave completely different than I thought they did, because, we obviously have the tools to, and sort of like the experience to look where you're not paying attention to. Like we recently had a client where that was like, I just want to reach millennials. Like let's hit millennials. Right. And that's like, yeah, that's not, just because you're going to be on social media doesn't mean you're going to hit millennials. And, we took a good month to 6 weeks of hard study to take a look at, what their core audience was and the people that they're trying to reach and who influences them. Right. And then working with those people and looking at those people to sort of like understand the type of content that's resonating with the audience they're trying to reach. So a lot more insights driven, a lot more sort of like thinking about like the right type of content and not just shooting content to be just to be there, right? Like just to tweet for the sake of tweeting, right? It's putting the right content out there, reaching the right audience, all that sort of stuff is where we
You
try to
find
focus.
that the message or approach is resonating with clients? Like right now, I'm trying to understand what your main challenge is. Is it going out and getting customers, which I imagine is an ongoing thing, or is it scaling? You have too much demand and you need to hire and train people?
I would say that the challenge right now is the ecosystem of there are a couple of like different challenges. There's one where brands think they can handle everything internally, and others where they think that just dumping a ton of money on one platform is going to bring their results. We recently had clients where like, oh, we're not going to spend any money on content. We're gonna dump $30,000 to $40,000 a month on Facebook, and we're like, okay, that's not like we're a fraction of that budget, but like it was. That's where the sort of like that challenges is where, first off, I've been a proponent of bringing like people in house to handle certain types of marketing, but I don't feel like it needs to be. It has to be all of it, and there is a sort of like a need for an outside perspective, an outside strategy, because I've been on the client side and I understand that like you end up being complacent. Like you're just going to do your job and, do what, like what you need to do, that you've been told to do. And that's mostly what you're going to, focus on for, a certain amount of time. And there is a danger there, right? Like where, like we're constantly looking at different clients, how different audiences are behaving. So there's a little bit of a challenge there, but are also like, like there's a perception that for one of the challenges for us is the perception of social media, right? We're not about, just social media. We're about, creating content for the social era, right? The web has always been social. Like, I always approach the web as a ways to connect with people, as opposed to connecting with I don't connect with MSN.ca, right? I don't connect with, whatever website. I connect with the people consuming that website, or people that talk about that content. And social media and the platforms have sort of like created this mass perception of social media, where it's like it's always been about these communities. And there is a problematic there, where clients just think, I just need to be on social media, and that's going to bring me clients. And social, for me, like, has become these platforms. When I say these platforms, I mean Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. They've become traditional marketing for me. They've become just another way to spend your budget on traditional ads. And if you approach them that way, you'll get the same results we used to get from banner advertising. And we need to sort of like educate people to understand that these are content delivery platforms, and there's ways to sort of like shape your content on these platforms so that they get more bang for your buck. And it's sort of like a hard sort of lesson to learn. And it's the problem with that. Again, I feel like I'm jumping from problem to problem, is that it's not overnight success. Agencies and marketing have created this ecosystem where you need to show results within a month. And if my sales haven't gone through the roof, the campaign failed. Whereas, the clients we work with are clients that are sort of long tail clients that understand that, like, building this content ecosystem, this social engagement and content that reaches people on a social level, is a long tail play. And it can take, 3, 6, 1 year to sort of like start really showing some good results. But at the end of the day, when you start seeing those results, you're starting to realizing that, that the money that you spend on content is a fraction of the money that you would have spent on a big media play for 3 months. And at the same time, that content lives on beyond, your campaign, that can be erased within 3 months. We have clients that have, we help them build YouTube strategies and YouTube content, and they're, approaching 30, 40, 50 videos per channel. And their channels are now seeing organic views, between, like I was just looking at one recently where she's seeing 500 views a day organically without, she took a break during the summer, and all of a sudden there's like, I thought, okay, the channel's going to die. It's like, no, the channel did not die. The channel is generating 500 views a day, and it's not going down. It's not going up, but it's like sustainable. And there's still people asking questions and engaging with the content on a regular basis, because we've built the content to be very, informational and helping people out. And sort of like answering a question that they as a client, as a product, they're answering questions that their potential clients are asking. So yeah, I feel like
you hit a few. Sorry to cut you off, but it's like you hit upon a few really good nuggets of wisdom, like the whole notion of measurement comes back, right? So like I think the best thing of the internet is that you can measure, and then it's the worst thing of the internet is that you can measure everything, right? Everyone expects that you get the same sort of traction from the same sort of mentality when you approach, let's say, a Google or Facebook ad when it comes to building a community and creating content, right? It's not the same thing in essence, right? So you need to be able to quantify, aspects of your marketing differently, and also the whole distinction of digital versus traditional, I find, is also starting to fade away, right? Like it's all just part of marketing.
Yep.
You just have a different toolkit, albeit with different measurement, different approach, different tactics, right? So distribution, content creation, and monetization ends up being kind of the core tenets of any strategy. But I find your approach, the way you're presenting it, is one that's very very apropos because the toolkit is all new, right? The foundational principles remain the
Yep.
same, but the toolkit is new, and people still don't know how to approach it in an intelligent fashion, right? So that's why I like your approach of being more strategic to kind of do these things, because it's not a cookie cutter approach, and what works for one brand doesn't work for another. Ergo, you need to be patient and you need to be able to understand these things.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I think one of the biggest issues is that we let these platforms sort of dictate the way content, or the way we need to sort of like the way we sort of engage with them, right? And at the same time, like, we're approaching the point where, Facebook has become WordPress, right? It's essentially a publishing platform. If you want people to get on it, you need to advertise to people to get on it, and that's the only way to get people to pay attention to your brand now on Facebook. Instagram is getting really close to becoming Facebook at this point. And it's, to this day, like even in the last couple of days, I've gotten creators and brands, asking me and saying, hey, have you noticed like my Instagram, I'm not getting as many likes as I used to, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, it's a Facebook company. It's going to turn into Facebook pay to play situation. And what these platforms did is they sort of like, they got brands and marketers addicted to the free drugs, right? Like they got us thinking, oh, I can get free reach just by tweeting, and or by creating a pretty picture. And then pulled back, as time went, pulled it back, and realizing like, oh, you need to pay to get that audience. And to this day, I still remember days, back in the agency days, where we would tell clients like, don't pay for likes, don't focus on this side of things, build your audience on your platform. And building a platform is hard, costs a lot of money. So a lot of brands to this day just use somebody else's platform to build theirs, but then get frustrated when that platform asks for money for to help continuing to build that brand. It makes sense from Facebook's perspective, but it's just a question of education on that side of things.
So what do you feel is happening in this space right now? That obviously there's a lot of buzzy things going on, right? Like everyone, like the flavor of the day. What do you think is underappreciated? It's not getting the attention it deserves.
I think the platform we're using right now is a platform that to this day is still confusing, but sort of like expanding at the same time and getting more and more. When I say the one we're using, I'm talking about podcasts and voice, right? That's the one where, like we're all talking about smart speakers these days. But, I've been admittedly a podcast addict for 10 years. And, I consume between 2 and 3 podcasts a day, from daily podcasts to weekly podcasts. And we produce podcasts for our clients as well as make our own. But the voice is one of the voice ecosystem for me is one of the most fascinating ones in terms of the content play. And from recently, I was looking at a new study that was released by Audience Insights here in Toronto, a company called Audience Insights, about the Canadian podcast ecosystem. And one of the insights that they brought in is that podcasts to this day still have the pod in the name of it that comes from iPod, right? And everybody still thinks of podcasts as something that's attached to an Apple product. And it's starting to break away from that because of smart speakers. Smart speakers are sort of like the Trojan horse for podcasting and for audio. And for me as somebody who adopts technology pretty quickly, like the smart speaker is something I use every day now, where like it's Good Morning Google, and then it gives me my pre-programmed news for the day. And then at night it's my music that I want in the background, and then whatever new podcast that I remember that I want to listen to. One of the interesting aspects of it is that when you think about voice and you think of like, how are you going to get people to be exposed to your brand? It's a completely different perspective, right? And, podcasts to this day have been like, very word of mouth. It's literally quasi impossible to build an audience for a podcast with traditional marketing. Even if you have a lot of marketing money, like the people that are going to start following your podcast are probably going to listen to one or two episodes and fall off. To this day, it's still a very organic sort of medium to build an audience. But when you do build that audience, it becomes super valuable and helps your content and helps get the word out and all that sort of stuff. So to me, that's a space that in Canada still has not, been fully embraced from the media ecosystem. We're seeing, CBC has been a big podcaster for years, but like, why is it only CBC, right? Like, for past 2-3 years, we've been listening to Canada Land, which is an awesome podcast. I just discovered a new one this week that's a sort of like a competitor to the New York Times daily podcast. I forget what it's called, The Big Story. And it's, again, every day there's a new sort of like a 10-minute podcast that talks about one specific story. And I'm like, wow, this is an ecosystem that has yet to be fully fleshed out because, up until now, nobody ever thought of daily podcast, right? And, when I say up until now, up until the last couple of years. And it's just, to me, a medium that is fascinating. I've been fully, embracing it for the past couple of months as we did our own. And and I still feel like I'm late to the game, right? Like, there are people in our industry that have been podcasting for like, 5-10 years. And, to this day, they're the early adopters. And, it, to me, it still has a hard time getting out there. Anyways, it's a world that's fascinating for me.
Yeah, no, we could geek out on podcasts for a
Yeah.
long time. I'm obviously, we're on a podcast, so it's like I
Yeah.
definitely believe in the strength of the medium, and I completely agree with you that it is very still underappreciated. And from any for-profit corporation should take the time to explore how you create content. A podcast medium could be actually really interesting, right? One
Yeah.
that cuts through the clutter, one that could be authentic and not BS. So I definitely agree with you there. And like maybe one more question in terms of like how you see the space, right? So like I feel like from my perspective, no longer kind of like in let's say the marketing world, but I feel like the winners have won, right? So you have YouTube, you have Facebook, Twitter, and then on the periphery, like things like Pinterest, Snapchat to a certain extent. But for all intents and purposes, like the map of social, quote unquote, has been kind of decided. So curious to understand from your perspective, do you think this is the new status quo? Or do you think that I'm wrong and it's actually there is a bunch of smaller players that deserve attention? And just curious as to where you see this landscape headed.
I think the gold rush of social platforms has ended. Like, I think the fallacy of creating anything and building an audience, and like when I say meaning anything, like putting a piece of content on there and building an audience is over. These platforms have all understood that it's like, yes, that you can try to get scale at first, but like it takes so long to sort of like figure out your monetization that sometimes it's not really worth it. For the past few years, you notice there's a lot less new social platforms being launched, right? And I do think that these platforms are starting to basically evolve into content management platforms at the end of the day. Like, they've all become these sort of like hosting services for your content. And it comes back to the idea of like, okay, well, what type of content do I need to make to break through the clutter? And that's the focus that we sort of like are in. Like, that's what we do. We're for our clients, we make content that breaks through the clutter, that reaches your specific audience. And it's going to be harder and harder to reach that audience unless you have a lot of money to put in front of a lot of people, very quickly, or you make content that becomes super valuable. And these platforms, the sort of like the platforms of creating very forgettable content have sort of like scaled back. You just don't see that anymore. I've to this day, like, I'm looking at like the stories format that's propagating the mobile web these days, from starting with Snapchat, evolving to Instagram, Facebook, and now YouTube's using it. Even other platforms like WhatsApp are using it as well. Like this piece of content is usually like forgotten within a day, if not even a couple of hours. How are we gonna how are brands gonna play into that ecosystem? To me is a fascinating one. And the evolution of content that disappears, to me feels like wrong. But at the same time, there's something to be said about, like, I don't need to be seeing your lunch from 2 days ago again and again, right? So the evolution of content that disappears and content that stays, like, that's to me like one of the fascinating evolutions of these platforms. And they're trying more and more to cater and find ways to serve both, right? And have content that becomes super valuable, that people rewatch and come back to, or that reaches a new audience regularly, and content that keeps your attention right now for this second, and then it's forgotten for after that. So to me, that's where these platforms are sort of going two different directions. And it's just interesting to sort of like try to, we approach much more in the long tail way of doing things. We do the sort of like the quick and easy content for brands, but we're much more interested in building that long tail audience for that we feel is much more valuable for our clients.
No, it's pretty interesting. Yeah, it's like the whole dichotomy between ephemeral versus content that could stay for years. I find it's an interesting juxtaposition, right? Versus like, I think the platforms are trying to have something that mimics real life, a real life conversation. Obviously, that's not recorded, disappears, and it's just in memory, which would be akin to a story or a Snapchat post, right?
Exactly.
It's interesting, but like you said, there's still very interesting creative ways to approach it. And I know we can go on for hours, Carlos, but I want to respect your time. And maybe one last question, Carlos, would be is, where can people find out more about what you guys are doing in Truly Social? Maybe connect with you online.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we strive to do is eat our own dog food. So we try to make a lot of content for ourselves and to put our thinking out there. So there's a couple of things. There's on YouTube, you can search for Truly Social or Tara Hunt, and you'll find our YouTube series. We have a new podcast, which to me is a daunting experience. Running a podcast is not easy, and running one continuously is not it's not as obvious as you think it is. So we have the Truly Social podcast everywhere, and you can find me on Twitter, or these days I prefer Twitter because I have weaned myself off of Facebook mostly, and I'm looking to get away from Instagram as time goes, because it's just these platforms have evolved in ways that are not ways I preach. I want to engage with people, so Twitter's where I enjoy engaging with people and having conversations back and forth. So you can find me, just search for Carlos Pacheco, but if you want the actual handle, it's tough to say, but it's Carlos Pacheco _CO. That's where you can find me. Obviously LinkedIn as well.
I'll link to it in the show notes as well, Carlos. So I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Point of No Return podcast. Never miss an episode by clicking on the subscribe button on iTunes or Google Play.